Hey everyone, I'm Mike Settele, the founder of Settele Tutoring, and in this lesson I'm going to talk about a very common SAT weakness, or more accurately, a very common SAT complaint, that the real SAT is harder than the practice tests. Now for some of you, this is just like an instantaneous reaction you have as soon as you get out of your exam. You're like, oh my god, that was so much harder than anything I've done in practice. There were questions on there I've never seen before, but then the scores come back and you ended up doing fine. But for some people, this is a real problem. They cut their scores back and they're consistently lower than their practice test scores, and maybe they consistently feel like the real test is harder than the practice test. So there are a couple of actual explanations for that we'll talk about, as well as some potential solutions to help you mitigate that problem. So let's get to the first thing. If it's the practice tests that you think are easier, which practice tests are you talking about? If it's tests 1, 2, and 3 in the Blue Book app, then you just might be right. Those are generally considered to be easier exams. They were released kind of early on in this whole transition to the digital SAT. They did make some changes to them in July of 2024 where they added some harder questions, but in my opinion, it didn't really affect things in too many ways about the difficulty. Plus, those hard questions don't really affect the score. I don't want to get into it here, but basically, yes, it is possible that if you only took tests 1, 2, and 3, that those are genuinely easier than the real exam. So one piece of advice is next time around, take tests 4, 5, and 6. The general consensus is that those are more realistic. People who have taken both those tests and the real exam feel that those are a good representation of what's on the actual test. Now, if you did take those and you still feel like the real test is harder, then there must be something else going on. And one way to kind of get started is maybe watch my walkthrough videos of those exams. Because instead of just going through the most efficient or best way to solve each question like I do in my individual question explanation videos, I'm seeing those questions for the first time. So I'm just reacting to them into the moment. And you can learn a lot from the way I react to a question, the way I deal with something that's difficult, the way I deal with running out of time. All of those kind of subtle things might be contributing in some way to the difference in perception between how you feel about the practice test, how you feel about the real exam, and maybe the ways that we are both approaching those things are different. And so those videos, if you've taken 4, 5, and 6 already, are a great way to kind of just see that overview of like, how do I think about the exam versus how do you think about it? So I definitely recommend them. Now, eventually we will get tests 7 and 8 and maybe 9 and 10. They haven't been released when I'm recording this video, but my prediction is those will also be fairly accurate exams. In the past, the SAT has made those later practice tests just copies of real exams that were released at some point or were given at some point. So I have a feeling those will also be very good resources. So for many of you, you might even recognize questions on those if you took an earlier version of the exam. And that brings me to a general idea that we always have to be wary of with these practice tests is we need to avoid spoilers. A big reason why lots of people find the practice tests easier is that they were watching some unscrupulous YouTuber or TikToker who didn't really care that they were spoiling the practice test questions. They just made their tips and tricks video by picking out the hardest questions from the practice test and just telling you the answers and how to solve. So then, of course, when you take that practice test, you already know the solution. You have an advantage. Your score is going to be inflated, but then the real exam, you're not going to have that advantage. So that can be a real problem that makes those practice tests easier than the real thing. And so it's really important that you find reliable, reputable prep resources for your SAT. I will never ever spoil a test question without labeling it first. So always check the title of my videos or the description to know where those questions came from. Another reason we might think the real test is harder is that we are nervous for the real test. And it's important to remember that perception is not the same as reality. As you are taking that exam, if you are nervous, you might feel like you're doing worse. You might feel like it's harder, but that doesn't mean it actually is. You have to separate those two things. What often happens is my students get nervous and then they start abandoning the plans that we set, the strategies that we worked on. It'll often happen that I'll be like, did you arithmetize on some questions? Did you plug points into equations? No, I didn't try it. I didn't think it was going to work. Well, why? It worked on the practice test. Why wouldn't it work on the real exam? So if you are nervous, you've got to prevent yourself from like second guessing. You've got to stick to the stuff you did in your practice. It will continue to work. So don't let nervousness throw you off your game. Do what you planned in practice and it will continue to work on the real test. A big part of that prep plan needs to be knowing what to do if you start running out of time. it's likely to happen. Even if it never happened on any of the practice tests, it is definitely possible that on the real exam, you will start to run out of time in the hard modules and you might need to guess on a question or two. So it happens when we had a randomly hard passage or a hard geometry question, something that just takes a lot of time. So if you have planned for that eventuality, then when it does happen, you won't panic, you won't second guess, you won't start abandoning your strategies. You will just deal with whatever the plan told you to do. And I do have lessons specifically about pacing in each of the modules so that you can have something ready to go for when that inevitably happens. And another thing about the nervousness is a lot of people really want to get rid of it. They're like, Mike, how do I be less nervous? And I could probably come up with a lesson on this specific topic, and maybe I'll have some more insightful ideas. But for now, I don't think that getting rid of nervousness is doable. It's better, instead of getting rid of nervousness on the real test, to add nervousness into the practice tests. You really want to feel the way the real test is going to feel when you take those practice tests. So try to psych yourself up, get in the right frame of mind. If you're just taking those practice tests leisurely, then yeah, the real test is going to feel different because it counts. But you can get yourself in that state of mind where the practice tests feel just like a dress rehearsal for the real thing. It takes some practice, but once you get to that point, then you're practicing what it feels like to be nervous. So when you take the real test, it's not any different from what you've been doing all along. So you really want those practice tests as much as possible to feel like the real thing. Now, here's where it gets a little controversial. If you feel like the real test is harder than the practice test, you might just be wrong. It's not really the case necessarily that it's harder. So part of this comes back to that idea of perception versus reality, right? We might feel like we're doing badly. We might feel like the questions are harder. And in many cases, maybe they are. You know, it's an SAT. It's going to have a lot of variety from one test to another. But the slight differences in difficulty from exam to exam are evened out in the scoring curve. So you can't let that kind of part of the game get to you in the moment. You just need to try to maximize the right answers as much as possible. Plus, again, people are often just wrong about this. I've been doing this for a long time, and on older versions of the SAT, they used to actually release the exam questions a couple of weeks after certain exam dates were given. So what would happen is my students would come out, they'd say, Mike, oh my God, it was so much harder than anything we did. There were stuff we never seen before. There were topics I'd never done. The strategies didn't work. It was completely different from all the practice we've done. And then a couple of weeks would go by, they'd release the questions, I'd sit down with my students and I'd do those questions from their real test. And I'd show them, look, this is the exact same stuff we did. Maybe it's phrased a little bit differently, but it's the same strategies, the same ideas. It's not different. So something is happening that is making you perceive a difference when there isn't really one. And I think it's because some people just can't accept that part of the SAT, every SAT, is going to be unpredictable. There will be things that you've never seen before. Or more accurately, the same topics that are on every SAT are going to be combined in ways that you've never seen before on every SAT. So you will get questions that are not things you've been able to memorize because it's not a process that you can memorize. It's a weird combination of topics. So you have to be able to deal with that unpredictability. And some people just have trouble with that. So there are two things to kind of think about and to accept, I think, that really can help with that. It's a little bit of luck and it's a little bit of skill. Yes, there is luck involved, and sometimes you get bad luck on the SAT. You get vocab words you've never seen before. Even if you've studied 500, 1,000 words, sometimes you just get words you've never seen. Sometimes you get passages that are really hard, you just can't understand. Or maybe it's an obscure math topic like box plots or margin of error, something in geometry or statistics that you just don't get a lot of practice with on the practice materials because there's just not that many questions on it. But if you've been studying, that stuff can be managed, but you also can't let it throw you off your game and make you panic. Just like I said, your perception of that question is not necessarily the reality. It might really be easy. You just got to not let the weirdness of it bother you. But that also leads to some skills that we want to work on. So obviously we want to have a perfect memory. You do not want to be staring at a question and be like, oh wait, what's the vertex formula again? Is it negative b over 2a or negative b over a? You can't have those moments. Every formula, every grammar rule, every transition word needs to be perfectly memorized. But beyond that, it's not just a memory test, right? The SAT, if it was just a memory test, everyone would get a 1600 because you just study as long as it takes to memorize all the stuff. It's about taking those pieces of information and bringing them together. And that's where dissecting the topics is a very important skill. And again, those walkthrough videos I do of tests 4, 5, and 6, you will see me look at a question and start to pick it apart. What's it about? What formulas am I going to need? What rules am I going to use? So all that is very important. And I think some people don't ever really develop that skill. And so when they get to the real test, they don't have an ability to deal with that unpredictability. And that's where being flexible is also kind of its own skill, is some things will just seem so different from what you've seen before, but you can't let that panic you. You need to have a bunch of tools that you are using to be able to kind of try stuff and just take risks on questions that you don't know if the solution is going to work, but it's worth trying out. So let's talk about some of the specific solutions that we can kind of use to maybe manage this perception reality issue, this sense that the test is harder when it's the real test versus the practice test. Now, some things I've said before, right? Take the right practice test, take 4, 5, and 6, be in the right frame of mind, be nervous if you can while you take those practice tests, accept the fact that luck is a factor so that when you do hit a vocab word you've never seen before, it doesn't really bother you. It's just part of the game. But also build those skills that allow you to be flexible and deal with the unpredictability. The videos that I have on the common weaknesses are a great place to start. This video here is pretty vague because there's lots of ways that you can have a perception issue where you can think that the real test is harder than the practice test, but hopefully we're going to start to find the specific things for you that make it so that you can get back to that same comfort you have on the practice test. One thing you can do is learn more vocab. I've got a video on that. A great place that a lot of people struggle is knowing where to start on questions. They stare at things and stare at things. And this gets to that dissecting the topic. You need a step one strategy that's going to work on lots of different topics of questions so you can get the ball rolling without necessarily knowing where it's going to end up, right? You don't need to know step 2 to do step 1. You also need to make sure you've got a pacing plan. I've got videos on that. You need to memorize all the formulas and have that be perfect. But beyond that memory, you also need to make sure you are filling your toolbox of strategies and techniques that you're going to use on those really weird, quirky questions. So for me, when I look at a question, I don't have just one thing I'm doing. I'm not just doing algebra for every math question. I know that I can arithmetize or plug points in equations, maybe use Desmos. But for some of you, all of your SAT prep comes down to like, I'm just going to use Desmos as much as possible. That's one tool and it won't always work. And so we need to have a lot of tools in that toolbox so that no matter what situation we have a bunch of different things that we can reach for and try. That's the only way to really master the SAT, is to have a lot of paths that you can take through a question. And the best way to learn more paths is to go to my channel homepage. My strategy series definitely covers as many tools as I can think of when I made that strategy series, and it will do that without spoiling any of the practice tests. So that's a great place to start. And like I said, the playlist I have on the weaknesses, I'll put that in the description. That'll also kind of start to pinpoint some of the things we talked about in this video. I know it's vague, me saying that, yeah, the test is harder. What are you going to do about it? But hopefully one or two of the things I talked about spoke to you. Each student is different, so your weaknesses might not be someone else's, but the more you can kind of pinpoint them and start working on them, the less they'll be weaknesses. Hopefully this helped. Again, my name is Mike Settele, founder of Settele Tutoring. And remember, when it comes to your scores, don't settle for less, Settele for more. Thanks for watching.